The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to start by saying that I will be sharing my time with the member for Rosemount Petite Patrie.
And I'm very pleased to be rising today to a motion that I think states the obvious, which is that holding an election during the pandemic is not a good idea. I'm coming to you from Elmwood-Transcona in Manitoba, where we're just experiencing a serious tightening in the pandemic restrictions. Stores' capacities are being severely restricted. Our schools are just closing. Visiting even outside on the property of family and friends has just been prohibited. And the last thing on people's minds, just as my Conservative colleague said was true for his riding there, I think it's true here as well in Elmwood-Transcona, that for most people, the last thing on their mind is having an election. Even if they're not necessarily impressed with the response of the government to everything in the pandemic, I think they recognize it's better that Parliament be able to continue to work and put pressure on the government to get things right, rather than suspending Parliament, allowing the government to govern with a free hand during an election, and then not knowing what the outcome of that election is going to be, both in terms of who might form a government afterward, but also whether we'll be able to elect a full House of MPs, because we have, of course, the example of Newfoundland and Labrador, where they weren't able to complete their election as first seen, and a lot of disputes about the legitimacy of political outcomes arose from that. And what Canada can't afford right now is to add a political crisis on top of a health and economic crisis. And that's why this motion is so important, particularly when you consider, as I said, restrictions are getting more serious here in Manitoba, but in some cases that just means that we're implementing things that have already been the case for some time now in the third wave in other provinces. There are some provinces where restrictions are still looser. The point is that even though we've seen some provincial elections take place during certain times of the pandemic and be able to pull them off, the challenge of pulling that off from coast to coast to coast across 10 provinces and 3 territories is far more than pulling it off at the provincial level. And we've seen, even at that level, that it can fail. And so the logistics of a federal election are orders of magnitude more complex than a provincial election. And that's why it's all the more important that we avoid, if we can, a federal election. Now, what does that take? That takes some good faith and some goodwill by all players in the House, but particularly the government, who has to find a way forward. And it doesn't mean that it needs to always have a consensus among all the parties, but at least has to have a meaningful partner on each of the initiatives that it's moving forward with. And it has to recognize that where it can't find a meaningful partner, it doesn't have a mandate to move forward on a particular issue. So, how does that fall apart? Well, the only way that it should fall apart is if the other parties all end up voting against the government at the same time. That's the only real proof that the government can't find a consensus on an important or key part of its mandate. That's the real test. It's not how the Prime Minister feels when he wakes up in the morning and whether he's upset because certain members of the opposition have criticized him too much on something, or whether they're speaking more than he might like to certain things. If he can find another partner, certain things can be expedited. We've seen that, and we, the NDP, just recently, it's come up earlier. I mean, worked with the government to try and get Bill C-19 to committee, because we think it's important that that pass, and I'll have more to say on that in just a little bit. What I want to note for the time being is that the Bloc, in putting this motion forward, and not for the first time, they've said this before, does not think that an election should occur in the pandemic, has committed not to causing an election during the pandemic. The Conservative Party has been on record for a long time now, I think at least back to February, when the leader of the Conservatives said very clearly in the Toronto Star that he would not trigger an election. And yes, they voted against the budget, and yes, they voted against other things. They've done that knowing that another responsible party would pick up the slack and do their job and make sure that there wouldn't be an election. We all have strong feelings about what the government does, but we're very mindful of the consequences of our actions in the New Democratic Caucus, and we're willing to be the adult in the room. We've said for a long time, going back to June of 2020, I wrote my colleagues on the Democratic Reform File saying we need to talk about what happens if the situation in Parliament leads to an election. Didn't hear back for the summer, but we did eventually get a study at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. And the outcome of that study was an all-party recommendation. No one dissented from that recommendation, which is in black and white in the final report of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, that says there should not be an election in the pandemic unless the government loses a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, which it has not yet done. And it doesn't matter if some parties vote against the government. What matters is whether the government can find a partner in order to get its vital business through the House. And so far, it has been able to do that. And our opinion is that it should continue to try to do that. And as long as it's willing to make reasonable compromises, it can do that until we get out of the pandemic. So if we have the Conservatives saying they don't want an election in the pandemic, the Bloc saying they don't want an election during the pandemic, New Democrats are saying they don't want an election in the pandemic, how could it possibly happen? Except if the Prime Minister unilaterally decides to exercise the powers of his office and call an election, even though the opposition parties don't think we should have one. And after repeated calls for him to commit not to take that road and to put Canadians who are worried that we might end up having a political crisis on top of a health and economic crisis at ease, the Prime Minister refuses to make that commitment, which is a point of serious frustration, and leads me to the point about Bill C-19, which came up earlier. Yes, the NDP worked with the government because what we saw was a consensus around the principle of the bill. And that's the same consensus that I witnessed around the table at PROC from an all-party point of view that you can read about in the final report by the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, that the current rules for an election, if we try and run an election just as if it's any other election, as if the pandemic didn't happen, it's going to lead to failure. If not failure on the health side, then on the democratic side. We need to try and have some accommodation. Now, why is that a matter of urgency? Because the Prime Minister refuses not to call one. So, I'm surprised to some extent at the level of trust that my Conservative and Bloc colleagues seem to have in the Prime Minister to put the public good ahead of his own private political interests. New Democrats don't share that faith. We're willing to negotiate with a government we often disagree with in order to get things done and in order to make Parliament work. But that in no way leads to any kind of naive faith on our part about this Prime Minister. A Prime Minister whose right-hand man through a large part of the pandemic, Bill Morneau, was just found to have committed ethical violations in respect of the We Charity scandal. A Prime Minister who himself, on many occasions, on a number of issues, whether it was Billionaire Island or other things, has been found to be in breach of the code of ethics for members of Parliament, for government. That hasn't happened with a lot of prime ministers. So this isn't the guy to put your faith in when it comes to making decisions that put the public good ahead of his own private interest. So we're not naive about that. And it's why we think it's important that C-19 continue to make progress, because whether opposition parties want it or not, whether Canadians want it or not, the Prime Minister has made it very clear that he is going to defend his right to call an election whenever it suits his purposes. Because if he wasn't committed to that view, he would already have come out and said, I am not going to call an election unless I lose a confidence vote in the House of Commons. And he won't say that. And we're all good at reading between the lines here on Parliament Hill. We know exactly what that means. So with agreement on the principle, as I say, I never heard in the debate we had either at PROC on a pandemic election or in the several hours of debate we had in the House on C-19 that anyone disagreed that the rules needed to be changed. The point is to get those changes right. That work should happen at committee. The bill can be there now. Once the Liberals stop filibustering at that committee, then we can get on with that work. And we need to get on with that work because we know the Prime Minister can't be trusted to put the public interest of Canadians ahead of his own private political gain. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire. L'honorable député de Montcalm.
The Honourable Member from Montcalm.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my colleague tell me, with full integrity, and I recognize his intellectual integrity, how many times he had to vote with the government against his own convictions to prevent an election? The member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Nous avons été toujours clairs qu'on est...
We had always been clear that we didn't agree with all the details of something like a budget, for instance. However, there's a public interest to avoid an election. And often, during this legislature, when the government was in a mode where it was ready to work with opposition parties, the NDP managed to move forward real initiatives that benefited Canadian men and women, whether it was with CERB or Canadians who lost their jobs, or for students, for people living with a disability, and a whole host of measures that helped Canadians. I'm pleased with our performance during this legislature, and I'm happy to work with a government that will negotiate with other parties. I think that's how we can make this parliament work and avoid an election. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Speaker, the member talked about reading between the lines, so I don't think he needs to read between the lines. He said in his own speech that the PROC committee, all members, including the Liberal members, agreed to that recommendation about having an election during a pandemic. Indeed, this side of the House hasn't even said that we're not voting in favor of this motion. You know, I think that this is a fairly good motion, and there's a really good possibility that we'll vote in favor of this. So I wouldn't sell this government short with comments about reading between the lines, but I did appreciate his comment about being the responsible adult at the table. Unfortunately, by being the responsible adults at the table, it means that the irresponsible people at the table are going to start to rely on that responsible adult to carry this government. So I hope this member will continue to exercise good judgment in being a responsible member at the table so that we can continue to do the good work for Canadians.
Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't recall having made any allusion to how the government side might vote in respect of this motion, and I've witnessed many occasions where government members have voted for motions in the House that the government had no intention of honoring. So I can fully appreciate that Liberals may well vote for this motion, but that doesn't tell us what the Prime Minister is going to do. And I think that if Liberals were really serious about not having an election, what we would hear is a crystal clear commitment from the Prime Minister himself that he will not call an election unless he loses a confidence vote in the House of Commons as per the final recommendation of the final report by the Procedure and House Affairs Committee on a pandemic election. That would put it beyond a shadow of a doubt. That is very much what I would like to see. It is the Prime Minister's decision alone. It's not up to any other member in the House on the government side. Likewise with his decision to prorogue, which is why I've been adamant that we need to hear from the Prime Minister on that decision at PROC. He's also refused to appear to defend how he exercises the powers of his office, whether it's by pausing Parliament.
And we'll need to get one more question in there. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleague from Elmwood-Transcona. I want to shift gears a bit because the member for Elmwood-Transcona happens to be an expert in an area that I find fascinating, and that's the confidence conventions. That when a government falls, do we automatically go into an election? Any comments from the honourable member?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much for that question. And of course, we don't need to go right into an election if a government falls. I think that is why it would behoove us all to have a system where a government can only fall on what's sometimes referred to as a a constructive confidence motion or a constructive motion of non-confidence, as the case may be, where the House actually indicates a preference for what is to happen next, whether it's the formation of some other kind of government backed by a coalition or confidence and supply agreement, so that members can say, hey, we don't like this budget, we don't think that it did the trick, for instance, and here's our solution for how we move forward, rather than leaving it to the discretion of the Prime Minister. The problem here is too much discretion for the Prime Minister and not enough explicit, transparent statements by him about how he's going to conduct himself that he can be held to account for.